technologically challenged, I guess. If we don't have it, that's okay. Okay. Father's love, indefinite article, okay? So, I grew up in this place called Glove Hollow. And if you go up Route 3 here, I don't know, about 35 miles, you'll go through it. It's just a little bit south of Plymouth. It's actually in the township of Plymouth. There's a Christmas tree farm there now, and before, when I grew up, there was no Christmas tree farm there. There was just a big farmer's field where he grew all sorts of vegetables and kept dairy cows. And growing up there, we were kind of a close family. My father and mother were not members of the Lord's church. I think they were at one time in the Congregational church, and then they became Methodists. Which way do I go here? Let's see. Did I do something right or wrong? All right, there we go. Now, this is not us by any means riding on that cow, but I have ridden on a cow before, and when I was, I don't know, maybe 2.5, my father said, you can ride the cow home, but you got to be able to walk up to where it is with me, because I'm not carrying you to where the cow was. And I don't know, it was maybe a quarter mile, but it seemed like walking from here to Walmart back then when you were that small, you know. So I thought it was a big deal. I was a big guy. I could get up there and I could ride the cow. And I don't know if anybody's ever ridden on a cow. It's like riding on a 1-inch board. Sitting on a 1-inch board, it's not very comfortable. That old spine there is just one of them things. And in 1964, there we go. We got going on here, Patrick. Yeah, 1964 anyway. I was in kindergarten, and Martha could probably tell you this. Anytime that we get the first snow, all the kids get excited in school, and we used to run to the windows, and then the teacher would have to settle us all down. So we got the first snow in November. I was like 5 years old. So I got all excited about it, and I knew what I was going to do. When I got home, I was going to go out in the attic, and I was going to get a sled. We had this mound of dirt out back of the house where I lived, and going to try it out, take my first ride on a sled that winter. In the process, I was all filled with adrenaline and excitement, and I ran out of the attic, and I stepped on a rusty nail, and I was so excited I never realized it. You know, wow, you know, got a sled, you know, and I just realized I'd pricked myself with that nail. Any other time I probably would have bawled over it, but later on that night, I told my father, I said, I stepped on a nail, and he goes, yeah, okay, I'll look at it when we get home. And it had gone all the way through my foot, through the in between the metacarpals and my foot, and come out the top. And of course, he kind of, I wouldn't really say he freaked out, but he got pretty serious about things. And later on, that infection grew into a blood poisoning, and I nearly lost my leg, nearly lost my life. And the reason I say this is because if I wouldn't have had a loving father back then, I would have been dead a long time ago, okay? Him and my brother, every night after supper, they'd boil water on the stove, because at that particular time, we didn't have a water heater in that house. It wasn't until my Uncle Glenn gave us a water heater that we had a water heater. So you boil it on the range, and over in the corner of the kitchen was an old Norge range. It had kerosene on one side and gas on the other, which was quite common back then. In that era, still is common in Canada, believe it or not. We boiled the water, and the water was pretty hot for someone who was small. My brother would kind of hold my leg in there. Father would read me stories, and that's when I learned that he was a master storyteller. And I told you about that last week. The guy could tell these stories that would just kind of draw you in with the details, and it was just one of those blessings I had as a child. And if it wouldn't have been for his dedication, his care and concern for me, I wouldn't be here. Okay, my brother was also involved in that. He was the guy that held my leg in the hot water. Eventually, that Epsom salt and hot water back then drew all the poison out of my leg, and I was able to walk again. And I think I was out of kindergarten maybe 4 weeks until I was able to walk. I remember my mother having to take a pair of scissors and cut the tongue out of my shoe because my foot was still swelled some. And when it was laced up, that bothered my foot. So the point I want to make is, let's turn over to 1 Corinthians. Go. And next one, I guess. Anyway, in Romans chapter 1, I'm sorry, not 1 Corinthians. I don't know why I had Corinthians on the brain. But in Romans chapter 1, there is a word over here that's used in a couple places in the Scriptures. And there are four basic types of love in the Greek language. You have eros, you have storgos, you have agape, and phileo. And storgos and eros are not actually used in the New Testament. They're alluded to in this word that you find here in Romans chapter 1. In the King James, it would say lacks natural or parental affection. Okay? You'll see it down here. Paul gives this massive catalog of sins that the Gentiles were guilty of in chapter 1. And then basically what chapter 2 tells them is, you Jews, you are no different. You're still sinful. And then he brings it all together in chapter 3 and tells everyone that they are sinful, all of them. And then he presents a reason or a way to have that sin taken away. So we read here in verse 31 of chapter 1 of Romans. It tells us, it says, without understanding, untrustworthy, unloving. Now that's the word astorgos. Okay? It's the opposite of storgos. In the Greek, when you put an A in front of it, it makes it the opposite. It's like in symbolic logic, when you put a title in front of a substitution instance, it makes it a negative of that instance. In an argument, you can do that. You put a title in front of it, and it makes it the negation of it, the opposite of it. This is the opposite of that word, someone who is lacking these characteristics. And I bring this out because my dad had these certain characteristics that a father is supposed to have and supposed to exemplify. All right? So, in this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to transition from a loving father, all right, to the loving Father, okay? So all of us have the loving Father. I had a loving father when I grew up. A lot of people today don't have that experience. The fathers are not available. They're not around. They leave. Lots of reasons. In fact, 50% of the children today don't have their biological father with them. Okay? Well, even more than that now, I believe. And if you look at the stats are alarming as to what happens when a father is not involved with his children. I was going to present some of that today, but I decided just stick with the Scriptures, because that's what I know the best. Otherwise, I'm taking someone's word about something. So turn me over to Matthew. You go to Matthew chapter 6. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount, and when I was young and I could remember stuff, that was one of the first sections of the Bible I memorized with the Sermon on the Mount. And it kind of benefited me in some ways, and I've been able to preach a lot of sermons off of that basis, because this is the theology of Jesus. The Sermon on the Mount is, and you'll find the basis of his theology in the Beatitudes in the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And as you get into chapter 5, you'll see where Jesus didn't necessarily correct what was going on, but he laid down some new things about the way things were supposed to be, the way that God had always wanted it to be, and how it had been misunderstood, misused. And in chapter 6, he gives us some other specific directions, like giving to the poor and prayer, and there's, of course, the model prayer comes from that. And then you have fasting, and where true treasure is. Okay, and we get down here in verse 25 of chapter 6, and he says, "For this reason, when I say to you, do not be worried. For this reason I say to you, do not be worried." Now, when you see the word "for," that is a directional statement. It's pointing to something, and he's pointing to the concept of the fact that they had anxiety or they were worried. Now, this particular passage is a beautiful passage that gives us the cure for anxiety. Okay, what is anxiety? Well, if you look it up in a book on psychology, it's going to tell you that it's the concept of the premonition of fear, where you perceive fear, okay? Like I might have a fear about what's around the corner as opposed to a ugly dog being right here. That would be an actual fear. My fear would be supposed, it would be assumed, and, many times we do this, A couple years ago, hit a tree with one of the company trucks. And I had a certain amount of anxiety about that because you never know what the company is going to do when that happens. And my anxiety was actually short-lived because it wasn't anywhere near what I thought was going to happen, you know. Sometimes it's worse. Most of the time it's not. 95% of the time we're going to assume that it's worse than it will be. Okay? So he gives us a cure for anxiety, and the cure is this. For this reason I say unto you, don't be worried about your life as to what you will eat or what you will drink, or your body, or as to what you will put on. Is not life more than food and body more than clothing? Is that all our life is about, is what we wear and what we eat, what we drink, the way we live? No, that's not what it's about. He says, look at the birds of the air, that they do not sow, nor reap, nor gather together into barns, yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are they not worth much more? Are you not worth much more than they? When we think about this, we look at the birds around here and how they're always out there trying to find something to eat, and God provides for them through his divine providence. Through his natural providence that he set up out there in the world as food for these birds, God takes care of them. Okay? He provides for them. And when we have this anxiety about this stuff and worry about these things, it basically means that we don't trust God. We don't trust in his providence and his ability to provide for us. So what do? We trust in our own means of providing, our own way of developing, or our own way of providence, in other words, and how we provide for ourselves. Are you not worth much more than they? Are we not worth much more than birds to God? Yeah, we're worth a lot more. We're his children. Okay, verse 27 says, and who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? Now the King James says as a cubit to your height, okay? Who can make himself taller? Who can make his life longer by worrying about it? You can't. In fact, you're going to make your life shorter, probably. That's what doctors and medical statisticians will tell you. If you worry, it's going to shorten your life, if anything. It's going to give you stress that you don't need. And no one can do this. We can't add to our lives. And why are you worried about clothing? Observe the lilies of the field, how they toil not, neither do they spin. I worked in a factory one time where we made cloth. And we had all these spinning machines. And we made some pretty good cloth, but we made nothing like the flowers of the field. Beautiful stuff. If you go and look across these fields, anybody ever see those pictures of Mount Rainier on the southeast side with those mountain flowers all growing up there and the sun comes up on it? Oh, just stunning. That's what it is. Beautiful. And man cannot make anything like that. This is what God made. And these are very simple things, flowers, okay? They don't toil, they don't spin. And he says, yet I say unto you, even Solomon in all of his glory clothed himself like Solomon in all of his glory was not clothed like these, okay? Solomon, being the wisest man ever except for Christ, was not clothed in the beauty and splendor of these flowers of the field. He goes on to tell us, but if God so clothe the grass of the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace. Now, we what? Well, you have to understand, in this society here, you didn't have a lot of wood. So they used what they called packs of grass. There's another name for it, where they actually wound them together and they burned them, used them as fuel to make stuff. Out on the prairie, that's what they did out there. There were no trees in the prairie, so they'd cut the grass, they'd mow it, and they'd make it into these skeins of grass, and they'd throw them in the fire and use them as fuel. And the only other source of fuel you had out there, of course, was buffalo chips, which we're not going to go into talking about that. That's another thing, all right? But you had to find a source of fuel so you could heat and you could cook for yourself. That's what we're talking about. That's what happens to these beautiful flowers. They die tomorrow. They're cut down. They're thrown in the furnace. Will he not clothe you more than they, is what the question would be. Yeah, God knows us. We're his children. He cares for us. He is the loving Father. I had a loving Father when I was a kid. He is our loving Father, the loving Father. Okay? He knows what's going on in our lives, and sometimes we think that God sits in some obscure place and is incoherent of what we're doing, but he knows. He's aware of what we're doing. He's aware of what's going on in our lives. He's aware of our needs. And this is what this passage is telling us. It's telling us trust in God, just like what Isaiah said throughout the course of his entire book was to trust in God. And that's what happens when you have anxiety. You have a lack of trust in God. Do not worry. Verse 31 says, what we shall eat, what shall we drink, or what shall we wear as clothing? And I can remember my sisters when they were older than I were, two of them, and they were always worried about, I have nothing to wear. They were going on a date, and they'd always say, I have nothing to wear. And they had a closet full of clothes, and as a young boy, I'd say, well, what do you mean? That stuff's all clean. Of course, I didn't understand what they were talking about, you know. But that's the thing, see? We get concerned and we get caught up in these things. We get caught up in the necessities. We get caught up in what we see as needs, when actually most of the time they're wants, okay? God will provide for us. The Gentiles, they search eagerly for these things. And you think about people around us and what they search for and what they do and how they get the stuff they've got and the amount of time that they take to get these things. And in the course of that, they have no place for God. In other words, no room for Father, the Father, in their lives. No place for him. We have to make sure that's not the situation with us. We have to have a place for God in our lives. A supreme place of honor, a place of adoration for the supreme creator of the universe. Verse 33 puts it in perspective. He tells us not to do these things, not to worry. Okay, God will provide, but what does he tell us to do? Okay? He tells us to seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Okay, we put it in perspective. We seek kingdom and his righteousness. We're studying our Bibles. We're in fellowship with our brothers and sisters. We're serving God. We're doing the things that God wants us to do. And these things that we worry about, God's going to take care of for us. The question is, do we trust him? You know, when I started going to school many years ago, one of the instructors said the number one problem in the church is that people don't believe enough. And I did a sermon some time ago where I passed a box around, and he opened the box up, and I told people not to tell anybody what was in the box. It went through the whole room, and because of COVID, we stopped passing the box in these sermons. And basically inside the box was a piece of paper that said, we don't believe, and I questioned it out as the number one problem in the Lord's church. You know, there's always someone talking about the number one problem. I went to a school this past Friday, and the number one cause of house fires is dryer vents. So there's always a number one cause of something, okay? Number one cause of problems in the Lord's church is the fact that we don't trust him because we don't believe what he says. Do we believe that God will do this for us? He tells us, seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. And then verse 34 tells us, in a summary of this, do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will take care of itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. You think about this, you ever sit around worrying about tomorrow? What's going to happen tomorrow? How am I going to deal with tomorrow? People do this. And then they end up having a lot of anxiety about this because it's unknown. It's a question mark. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That's a big question mark. Not that I'm trying to quote B.F. Skinner or any of those guys who said that man was just a big question mark. But this is telling us not to worry about that. Don't worry about what you can't know. Okay? I mean, if you get into the hypothetical, you could spend your entire life trying to find the hypothetical or trying to look for the hypothetical. And that's what he's telling us not to do. Just stick with what you've got today. That's enough. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Let's turn over to 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 7. I'm going to actually pick up this context in verse 6. 1 Peter 5, verse 6. Some of us are familiar with this. Probably most of us have heard this or know it pretty well. He tells us here, he says, therefore humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he will exalt you at the proper time. And that's one of the problems we have in our mistrust of God, is we don't humble ourselves. We don't allow him to be God. Okay? We want him to be something else, or we want to be the guy in the driver's seat thinking that we can take care of all these things. But we have to humble ourselves and allow God to be God and work in our lives in the way that he works. So therefore humble yourself under the mighty hand of God. He will exalt you in proper time. Casting, this is what God will do. He'll cast all your casting, well, that's what we do, cast all of our anxieties on him. And how do we do this? We do this through prayer and supplication. As we'll read in the next passage when we go over to Philippians. You got something that's bothering you, take it to God. You know, sometimes we don't do that. We bottle it up and we keep it in ourselves. And what happens if you take a bottle of soda pop and you keep shaking it, then you drop it on the floor? Well, I worked in a convenience store one time and I found out what happened. With a 2-liter bottle of orange soda, and I was moving it around, it fell off this rack and it bounced a couple of times, hit the floor, and then it ruptured. And it made this beautiful spray of orange soda all over the coolers, which almost instantly dried in the air. So I spent the rest of the evening not doing my other duties, but cleaning up the coolers, so that people wouldn't see all this sticky mess all over the front of them. It's a thing, see? And here we see this over in this passage, and he tells us, cast all of our anxieties on him. Why? Because God cares for us. He cares about us. He cares about what's going on. He wants to hear from us. If we got something bothering us, he wants us to bring it before him. Instead of bottling it up and being like that bottle of soda pop, or as us old Yankees call it, tonic. You know, Jim's laughing. He knows what I'm talking about. And spraying it all over the place, it makes things all sticky. Okay? Be sober. Be of sober spirit. Okay? This means pretty much to be in your right mind. Okay? That's what it's talking about. Be serious, be sober, be alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Okay? This gives us some insight into what Satan says, our enemy, our adversary. If you ever see a lion on television, I was watching this documentary on lions, and there was some kind of animal that went down this burrow. I think it was a hyena. I don't really remember. And it was just awesome to see the power of a lion. The lionesses were trying to get that animal out of there. And the male lion was sitting over in the shade. Finally, after a while, he went over to one fell swoop with his paw, pulled it out, whatever it was, bit it in the neck, and then went back in the shade and left it for the lionesses. And it was just awesome. It was just like, so then you think about Satan being that way, like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour, on the prowl, you know. It says, but resist him, firm in your faith, knowing that the same experiences of suffering are being accomplished by your brethren. Now, sometimes when we get into situations where things aren't going our way and we're suffering, we tend to lose faith, we tend to lose mindsight, we tend to lose our focus, tend to lose our vision in these particular things, and we have to keep ourselves sober. Okay? We have to stay alert. We have to, first of all, try to learn what's going on. We have to be able to work ourselves through it. Let's turn over to Philippians, and we'll close this lesson out over in Philippians chapter 4. And Patrick taught us Philippians a few months back. He did a wonderful job with it. There's some great notes that I got from Patrick's class. And this stuff is just so practical, okay? Because we wonder, is there some kind of a formula that we can follow that will, like we're always looking for some kind of formula for something. And here Paul kind of gives us the formula for Christian success in this passage. In chapter 4, verse 5, it says, conduct yourselves with wisdom toward outsiders. Okay, making the most of your opportunity, let your speech always be seasoned with salt, so that you will know how you should respond to each person. Now, be seasoned with salt, not battery acid, okay? Season it in a way that's appropriate. Don't be bitter about things or bitter towards people. Learn to become better instead of bitter. He tells us in verse 7 rather. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong book. I apologize. It did work though, didn't it? See? Improvise and adapt, right, Rob? Let's go back to Philippians chapter 4 where we're supposed to be. I was in Colossians. Please forgive me. He tells us here in verse 7, in verse 6, he tells us, be anxious for nothing in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. But in everything, by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. God wants to hear from you. If there's something going on in your life, bring it up to God. Tell him. He'll help you. He'll work through it with you. He'll help you find a way to work it through. Many times we leave God out of the equation. We try to do it on our own. Verse 7 says, and the peace of God which surpasses all comprehension will guard your hearts and minds in Jesus Christ. And verse 8 says, and here's the practical information. Finally, brethren, whatever is true, whatever is honorable, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is of good repute or good report, as the King James says, if there be any excellence, if there be anything worthy of praise, dwell on these things. But what do? We think about stuff that we shouldn't be thinking about. Okay? Dwell on this stuff. Dwell on these things. Take this verse and commit it to memory. I used to be able to memorize stuff a lot easier than I can now. Of course, a couple of concussions will kind of take that ability away from you. But it's a challenge. I still can do it some, but commit this to memory. Write it on a mirror. Write it on a wall, hopefully no one else's wall, you know. Your own wall in your own house, okay? And he tells us how to apply these things. Just don't think about them. And sometimes we say, okay, I'll think about it. But what does he tell us here in verse 9? He says, these things that you have learned, received, and heard, and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Do these things. You know, that's that little word that carries so much impact. Do. You know, someone said, well, what do you do? I don't do what most people do. Otherwise I wouldn't do, so I don't. You know, it sounds like a lot of double talk, but as Christians, we don't do the things that people in the world do. We do the things that God wants us to do. And that's what he's telling us here. Get your thinking right and get your doing right. Okay? If anybody has a need today, come while Patrick leads us in the song of invitation. I apologize for the PowerPoint.
What will you do with Jesus? The question.